speed. And I'm starting a fire. All right, let's not do the slow speed. Hey guys, welcome back. So today, working on these two Generac generators. The one here on the left is a 3500 XL, and the one on the right is a 4000 EXL. Now, these machines, they have had a hard life. You know, they were stored indoors, but a majority of their time was spent on a construction site. So they are high hours machines. The owner said he put them away about 15 years ago in running condition and hasn't used them since. So he asked us to go through them and get them running again. And initially, I thought this was going to be an easy task. You know, if they're put away running, then, you know, fuel should be the only problem here. But now that they are here, I can tell we do have other problems. The machine here on the right, you know, the engine pulls over. I hear the piston going up and down. But the compression feels a bit weak. So this engine might have issues. You know, if we're lucky, it just needs a valve adjustment. But the one here on the left actually doesn't rotate at all. So yeah, these machines, they need a bit of work. But the goal today is going to be to get both up and running again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So let's start with the machine that has the locked up engine, and we'll check the oil, just make sure it didn't run out. And no, I see oil in there. It's a couple threads down from full, but plenty of oil. You know, it is a bit dark, doesn't smell contaminated with fuel. So, you know, this engine I don't think locked up due to a lack of oil. So let's get the plug pulled out next. You know, that'll give us some insight as to what's going on. You know, if moisture got in the cylinder, that plug will be rusted. And sitting for as long as it has, it wouldn't surprise me if a bit of condensation got in there. Ooh, that is tight. Yeah, that's not a good sign. Ooh, we broke the plug. Yeah, very bad sign. That plug is not coming out. So I'm actually going to pull the tank. We'll get this heat shield off as well and see if we can break that plug free. So I'm just going to cut this fuel line. We'll put a new one on if we get to that point. All right, let's try this again. I'm not going to hold my breath, though, on this one. But we've got better access, a longer breaker bar. Yeah, it turned a little, but it feels really bad. And really tight. Not a good thing. Ooh. Yeah, and that's what I was afraid of. There is rust on the tip of that plug. So, yeah, not looking good. Surprisingly, though, it didn't look like it pulled any threads out of the head. So, we're not done yet. All right, let's take a look in there with the borescope. See how bad it is. Yeah, and it's pretty bad. So that's the piston right there. And on your left, you can see what the cylinder wall looks like. Yeah, that is not good. So let me switch the view here to the side camera so we can get a better look at the condition of the cylinder. And I believe that's the cylinder wall. So, yeah, unfortunately, this engine was exposed to a lot of moisture. I think that's a valve right there on your right. And because the cylinder is in such bad shape, you know, even if we broke it free, it's going to run pretty poorly. So, yeah, I would say this engine, unfortunately, is a parts engine. Yeah, not looking good for this engine. So I'm not sure what happened to it, but given the amount of corrosion on the cylinder wall, you know, even if we cleaned it up, it's going to be pitted pretty badly. So this, for sure, I would say is a parts machine. But the more concerning thing is that these, I believe, were stored in the same location. And although this engine rotates, it is down on compression. So let's shift gears. You know, we'll check the oil here, pull the plug, have a look in the cylinder, and just see if this machine looks a little bit more viable. But before we switch to the other machine, I'm going to get some Marvel Mystery Oil in here. And also some penetrating oil. You know, likely I'm going to take this apart, and if the engine rotates, it's going to make the process a lot easier. Oh. And this one has water in it. The oil color looks like milk chocolate. Maybe not a ton of water, but there's definitely water contamination in there. So we need to drain that, but let's pull the plug first, see what the cylinder looks like. And actually, this tank isn't secured either. So I do have the bolts for it. And I do have the heat shield as well. Well, this one rotates pretty easily. That's a good sign. Yeah, I wouldn't say this one looks great, though. There is definitely a bit of rust on here. You know, not as bad as the other one. So let's stick the borescope in there and see what we see. All right, actually I can see the pistons at the top, so I'm going to rotate the engine, get it closer to the bottom. And I hear oil dripping out the other side. All right, so from what I can see, looks to be a lot better over here. The piston's still kind of high up, so let me rotate the engine a little more. All right, let's check that. Ooh, yeah, I do see some issues here. So, not as bad as the other side, obviously, but there are some issues on that wall. So let's switch to the side view. Yeah, you can see the valves up there. So a little bit of rust. Not terrible. And if we go further down, you can see some rust on the cylinder wall. So yeah, not great, but this one will run. And I'm thinking once it does run, it's going to blow a lot of that out of there, a lot of that junk. I'm not sure why it's wet in there. So yeah, not great, but this one I think will run again. So that dripping I heard on the other side when rotating the engine over was oil coming out, but it was also water. So yeah, there's more water in there than I thought. So yeah, not a good sign. This engine for sure is going to be wounded and potentially might not make it, but we're not really going to know until we get it back up and running again. And I think this is going to make a mess given the location of the frame. But we'll try to direct it into the tray if we can. Yeah, that's all water coming out. And now a water-oil mix. Not good. All right, so now that most of the oil is out, let's have a look at the bottom end. See if that survived the water. And yeah, I mean, besides the coating of oil, the contaminated oil, things look pretty good. The counterweights on the crankshaft are not rusted. Gears are not rusted. And you can just get a glimpse of the cam there on your right. And surprisingly, that's not rusted either. So I would say this machine has a chance. So let's check the valves. I want to give this the best chance possible. And knowing that this is a high hours machine, that could be part of the issue. So I'm going to let the oil continue to drip out of the block while we check the valves. And then we'll fill it up with some fresh. All right, and things look pretty good up here. There is no rust. Gasket came off in one piece. So I'm going to rotate the engine until one valve is fully open, which is the exhaust. And we'll check the clearance on the intake. Now, it does feel like it's close to zero. The intake should be 5 thousandths, plus or minus a thousandth. So let's start with a 4, which is the tight side of the spec. And yeah, actually a 4 feels pretty good. So I'm going to leave that one alone. Let's check the exhaust. All right, so the exhaust should be 7 thousandths of an inch, plus or minus a thousandth. So we'll start with the tight side of the spec, which is a 6. And the 6 does not fit. So the exhaust, it is out of spec. Let's see how much it's out of spec. Let's try a 4. And a 4 feels pretty good. So yeah, a little on the tight side, but not too bad. But let's adjust it. We'll give the engine the best chance possible. Huh. That adjuster was loose. Yeah, that feels good. So we're at 7 thousandths. So I'm going to tighten that lock nut down and just double check the intake. Make sure that lock nut isn't loose. Nope, that one was good. So we get a brand new plug in there. It's a Champion RC12YC, gapped to 30 thousandths. And I just happen to have an oil filter that cross-references to this machine. So let's get that swapped out as well. Yeah, it's a good thing we're doing it too, because more water's coming out. And there's a look at the oil that came out. So yeah, not a good thing. Definitely a lot of water in that oil. So next we need to worry about the fuel situation. So the tank, it is empty and actually not secured. So I'm just going to get that out of the way for now. You know, this carb, I'm sure needs a bit of attention, but the owner also included a new clone carb. And I've had actually pretty good luck with these on this style engine. So I'm going to do the easy thing. We'll pull this one off and put the clone in its place. So there is a breather tube right here holding the airbox on. And not the best design. It's pretty hard actually to get the airbox back in place with the breather. And you have to build a sandwich with these bolts in the carburetor, so a bunch of things going on here. And we might try cleaning this up later. And I prefer to run OEM when possible. But at this point, we don't even know if the engine's any good. So we get the anti-surge spring connected up. And the governor rod shares the same hole. Yeah, like that. So we're connected and have, well, I was going to say we have full range of motion, but can we get to idle? Yes, we can. So let's get the airbox back on and the bolts. And we should be good as far as fuel goes. Actually, let's skip the airbox for now. I think we have enough threads to turn this in and tighten that properly onto the intake. Yeah, that bolt's a little bit too long. There's actually some metal that's hitting on the back side. This one should clear just fine. There's nothing in the back. But on the right side, we do need a shorter bolt. Or you could just use a stack of washers, which is what I'm going to do because the bolts that I have, they're either too long or too short. And I think before we try to start it, going to hook up a battery. This has electric start, so we'll get one temporarily installed. And I am also going to check for compression. I think we have some, just don't know how much. All right, let's hit the button. Perfect. So I'm going to test the oil pressure. The pressure sensor, it's right back there on the filter housing. Now, right now, there should be essentially no pressure, and that switch should be closed, sending a ground signal right here. So if we touch the test light there, it turns on. And actually, if we touch it anywhere, you know, that should turn on. So what I'm going to do is connect this to the test light. The other end is connected to battery positive. And I'm going to crank the engine over. We should see that light turn off if we're building pressure. And we're not. Let me just double check the lead here. Yeah, we have a good connection. So I'm going to crank it again. Huh. That's not a good sign. And it seems like we're not building any pressure. So this does have a low oil system. And if we are in fact not building pressure, then, likely it's going to shut things down pretty quickly. The other possibility too is that we're not cranking the engine fast enough, or maybe we have a bad pressure sensor. So, we could steal that from the parts machine. Although now that I say that out loud, I'm not sure that's an option. There is no oil filter and maybe no pressure sensor. So let's take a look. Actually, it does have one. A little crusty, but yeah, I'm thinking let's pull that out. Or actually, let's pull the other one out first, see if there's any signs of a problem there. And we'll swap the parts, see if that fixes the issue. So the big question is, can we get that off without pulling the exhaust? So I'm going to disconnect the two wires going into it, and then we'll try to break it free. And the answer would be no. So I'm going to probe on it actually with the two wires removed. Potentially there's something else going on here. Let's crank the engine. Okay, different result this time with the wires disconnected. So we're on the oil pressure sensor directly, and you can see the light went off. So if we give this a minute, the pressure will drop and the light should turn back on. So we'll give that a few seconds, and when it does that, we'll crank the engine again and just make sure we see the same result. Lights back on. Okay, good. So we're building oil pressure. A bit of a false alarm. Those two wires that were connected to it. I would assume one goes to the low oil module, and potentially that was interfering a bit with this test. So I'm going to get the wires reconnected, and then I think we can move on. So the compression came up quite a bit, and I'm pulling that pretty hard. I'm actually going to pull it right off the table. So there is minimal leak down. I would say the valve adjustment and more likely just cranking the engine over at speed, helped clean things up. So I'm not really concerned about the compression at this point. I think it's going to run just fine. So we might skip ahead and add some fuel and see if we can fire this thing up. So I'm going to use a bit of two-stroke fuel for the first start. Given the condition of that cylinder, it's going to need a little bit extra lubrication here, I think, for the first minute or so. Okay, needle and seat, they are working. We are full of fuel. Place your bets. We've got a light plugged in and turned on. We've also got the kilowatt, and we are full of fuel. So give it a bit of choke, put it in the run position, contact. It's trying. Let's try it again. Yeah, it looks like we're getting exhaust out of the intake, so we have issues with the valves. No big surprise. But if we can get it to run just a bit, I think a lot of that's going to clear up. Contact. And no, it's not clearing up. So yeah, let me let this dry out for a bit. We'll try it again. So I'm thinking we just have a bit of debris probably in that intake valve, because it was building compression originally. And now, yeah, it's back to not feeling great. My big concern here is just starting the carb on fire, because that intake is not sealing. And if we get a spark, that flame's going to come right out the intake. So, yeah, I'll give that a minute. We'll give it another go. All right, let's try it again. Contact. Not looking good. Yeah, it wasn't looking good there for a minute, but we did get the engine to start. The engine sounded good, and we're making power. 120 volts, about 61 hertz. So from that point of view, I'd say we're looking good. The engine compression also came up now that it's run a bit. So let's try restarting it, and hopefully that junk is cleared out and the machine starts without much effort. All right, ignition's on. It's been refueled. Contact. Well, you can't ask for much more than that. The engine started right up with the choke off and ran perfectly. So this engine, I would say, is a survivor. So now that we have some heat in the block, the engine has run a bit, let's get that oil changed again and get more of that moisture out of the block. So let's see what kind of condition this brand new oil is in. Yeah, I can see already it turned to a nice milk chocolate color. So, yeah, we're going to have to drain this a few times for sure. So let's get some more oil in here. I'm going to run it again just for a minute or two, and we'll flush the system again. All right, let's run this again. We're refueled. We got fresh oil. Engine is still warm. So we'll try it with the choke off. Nope, it's going to need a bit of choke. I'm also just going to pull this filter off. Try to get, as much of that oil out as we can. And let's run it for another minute. We are refueled. I just ran the engine 2 more times and flushed the oil, both from the block as well as the filter. And I've lined up all the oil change trays right here. So starting on the left, this is the first oil change after we got the engine running, the second, third, and this is the most recent over here. Still not perfect, but it's starting to clear up. and I'm willing to bet the next oil change is going to come out pretty good. So now that we've run the engine a few times, let's have another look inside the cylinder. Yeah, I'm not expecting it to look perfect, but I'm curious to see, what it looks like after running it for a few minutes. So it'll be interesting to see what this looks like. When running the engine, there was really no noticeable oil burning and no blow-by that I could sense. And yet we know the cylinder is not in great shape, so it's kind of surprising that it's running as well as it is. So we'll take a look here at the side camera. That is the exhaust valve. That actually looks pretty good. Let's see if we can rotate it and see the intake. Yeah, a lot of carbon on the intake. And the cylinder bore, yeah, doesn't look great. There is rust, there is pitting, and there's also some crosshatch. So it'll be interesting to see how this engine does when we perform the load test. So now that we have one machine up and running, kind of brings us back to this one right here, the one with the locked up engine. So, most likely this is a parts machine. I give it about a 0% chance of ever running again, but I have had the cylinder soaking now for a few hours in some penetrating oil. So let's get the starter recoil off. We'll get a breaker bar on the flywheel nut, and we'll see if we can't break this engine free. It just moved. Wow. Okay, maybe this one has a chance. The cylinder doesn't look great, but apparently it's not bad enough for the piston to not move. Although we're not making a full revolution yet, so we're going to have to work at this a little bit. So let's get some penetrating oil or some more oil in the cylinder and keep working at this. Yeah, we're making progress. Initially, we couldn't even get a half turn. It was a little bit short. But now we're getting, a half turn plus, almost 3/4 of a turn. And if we can get it to rotate once, then we can spin it with the drill. And get it rotating, hopefully good enough to try to start it. There we go. We even have a little bit of compression. so let's check the compression. This does have a decompression system. If everything's working right, we should see about 60 psi. Wow, I can't believe it. We have about 100 psi, which is actually a lot for something that has a decompression system. So let me spin it over a little slower. Okay, and like that, we're quite a bit lower, around 20. So let's spin it fast again. And actually we topped out a little bit lower this time at about 80 psi. So yeah, that's not great. I'm not sure the engine's going to fire with that much compression. I would think we would need at least 90 or 100. So we're close. Let's get the valve cover off. Maybe we'll get lucky and the valves are just out of adjustment. So we'll take a quick look at the valves. You know, it's very unlikely that the valves are the problem, at least the valve adjustment. You know, there could be rust for sure, preventing the valves from sealing right. But I would say the main culprit is probably the condition of the rings and the cylinder. But potentially they're off a little bit. And this engine needs all the help it can get. And like the other engine, it looks pretty good in here. There's no rust. So that's a good sign. Let's rotate the engine to open up one of the valves. The exhaust is open. And there's definitely some clearance here. Not a lot, but let's just rotate the engine a little more and see what the exhaust is like. Yeah, it might be tight, but not zero. So I was hoping one of the valves was just being hung open a little bit. But that does not seem to be the case. So let's put the feeler gauge in there and see exactly where it's at. Yeah, we'll start with the 6,000. So that would be the tight end of the spec on the exhaust, and it does not fit. How about 4,000s? And that doesn't fit either. So definitely out of spec. Let's try 2,000s. Yeah, that doesn't fit either. So that might be the smallest feeler gauge I have. Actually, I have a 1.5. Let's try that. Yeah, and that just barely fits. So we're not at 0, but definitely not the right clearance on that exhaust. So let's bring that up to 7, and then we'll check and set the intake. The other thing I'm thinking of too is potentially stuck rings. You know, there was oil in the cylinder. The first time we checked the compression, it was at about 100. The second time it dropped to 80. And that may have been due to the oil that I put down there. 7 has drag. And an 8 does not fit. So the exhaust is good. Let's set the intake. And the intake, I think it should be 5 thousandths if I remember right, plus or minus 1,000th. So we'll check the 5. That is tight. Let's check a 3. That's tight. A 2. Tight. How about a 1.5? Super tight at 1.5 thousandths. So yeah, those valves, they were very close to 0. So we'll open up the intake as well. Maybe with a different wrench. And we'll set that to 5 thousandths. Just right about there. Five has some drag. And a 6 doesn't fit. So that is perfect. So I get the cover back on, and we'll spin the engine over again, see where the compression's at. All right, let's check the compression again. I'm going to spin it over slowly first so the decompression system isn't bypassed. We should see about 60. And it looks like we're at 30. So, yeah, not great. Let's try spinning it over fast. And no change, really. About 75 PSI. So, yeah, I don't think the engine's going to run with that kind of compression. But we can always try. So I'm going to give a little bit of fuel right in the cylinder. That was probably too much. And we'll get the plug in. And we're going to have to spin this with the drill. You know, I don't think there's any chance that it's going to start with the manual starter recoil. But I'm hoping, like the other engine, once it runs a little bit, that compression might come up. All right, choke is on. We're already in the run position. Spin it with the drill. And I don't have a light hooked up. Not too optimistic here. Interesting. So the engine was spinning over fast and then it slowed down. And to be honest, I don't feel any compression anymore. So I would have thought that it would speed up. There might be something hung up in the valve. Let's spin it a little bit more, see if we can clear the problem. And no, we're not getting anything. So I'm going to pull, I think, the cover for the air box. We'll get a little bit of starting fluid right in there and try this again. All right, let's give this a try. I'm going to spin the engine over, and while spinning it with the drill, we'll feed it some fuel. See if we can get it to kick just a bit. Nope. We got a little smoke out of the exhaust, but that's it. And we're also getting some smoke out of the intake. So the valves, they're not sealing too well. Let's try it again. I think I'm going to kill the drill here. It's getting pretty hot. Let me switch to my other. Ooh. We got smoke coming out of the drill. All right, had to switch drills. The other one started smoking. Let's see if this one can start it. Okay, well, it came to life. Let's try it again. Yeah, I think the compression came up because this drill is now having problems, and I'm also overheating it a bit. So we don't have too many more tries here before this drill is done. Let's try it on the slower speed. All right, let's try it fast. Nope, this one can't do it. Let's go back to the other. All right, choke's open. Nice. Compression definitely came up. You know, before I did not feel a good compression stroke, but now absolutely do. So that is good. Let me do that one more time, and then we'll double check the compression, see where it's at now. Give it a little juice. Yeah, a lot harder for this to turn it over now. Let's try it in the slow speed. And I'm starting a fire. All right, let's not do the slow speed. Nice. Yeah, I can't believe it, but I've got to. The engine runs, and actually, compression came back. So let's get the compression tester back on there, see where it's at now. All right, so we're zeroed out. I'm going to start just by turning it over slowly. And with the decompression system, we should see it around 60. And we're just about there. I mean, we're at 50, and that's actually kind of in the normal range. It's 60 PSI plus or minus about 10. So still on the lower side, but we're on the low side of okay. So let's spin the engine over quickly and see where we peak out at. Incredible. We're at about 175 PSI. So that is actually pretty good. I think I said this way back in the beginning, but these are some well-made engines. And I would say any other engine would not be running, never mind at 175 PSI. So with that kind of compression, you know, we're not going to be missing a lot of horsepower. You know, this generator produces 3,500 watts, and for that you need about 6.5, maybe 7 horsepower. So, you know, if this was a brand new engine, I'd say no issues meeting that demand. This one, don't know. And we're not going to know until we get the fuel system repaired. So we're going to go through that in a minute. You know, between the carb I pulled off that machine and the one on this machine, we should be able to get a good carb out of it and get this machine up and running on its own. But before I do that, you know, let's pull the drain plug. We'll get the old oil out and get some new stuff in the engine. And to be honest, I almost didn't even try to bring this one back. You know, I thought it was too far gone, so I guess that's a lesson. Don't give up without trying, because you never know. That hasn't been out in a while. There's water in this engine too. I should have changed the oil first. All right, so let's get some oil back in here. You know, I let this drip dry overnight, so maybe this time we won't need to change the oil so many times. But we are going to have to do it, I'd say, at least twice. So for now, I'm just going to get oil back in the machine. And I think we need to turn our attention to the carburetor, you know, get the machine running on its own, and then we can flush the crankcase out. And there's a closer look at the oil that came out. So, like the other oil, definitely some water in there. These spots here, that's actually where I dropped some clean oil in when topping off the machine. Anyway, I'm going to set this aside. Let's shift gears and get a working carb on this machine. And some of you might remember the first thing my son ever printed for me was a cover for this machine. Generac still sells this part. It's about $60. And at the time, I thought it would make sense for him to learn how to design a complex shape. So he did that, and we ended up using it, but he was never happy with the design. So now that we have another with the same engine and the same airbox, he's actually making some revisions. And yeah, he's not quite there yet, but this is only his second attempt. He's redesigning it from scratch to more closely match, the original that came on this machine. Anyway, let's get this carb off. I'm hoping we can get this cleaned up and reused. Otherwise, we also have the carb we pulled from the other machine. So between the two, hopefully we can get one good. All right, so let's have a look in here. I don't think this one's going to be terrible. And I just say that because the choke is free, throttle plate is free, and I do hear liquid in there, which isn't a good sign. But I also hear the float moving around, so it can't be too bad. Although I just spilled some of that fuel on the ground and it does smell. So it's been in there for a while. Yeah, definitely old fuel. So some varnish on the bolt. Don't think it's rust though. So that should clean up. Yeah, we've got, I don't know if that's rust. I'm not sure where that would come from. There's a plastic tank on this. Needle's not stuck. Looks like the emulsion tube is clogged solid. And so is the main jet. So let's get the float out, as well as the needle. It was a little stuck. And let's see if we can get that jet out without causing any damage. Yeah, I don't like that screwdriver in there. It's too loose. Let me find a better one. No, that one doesn't feel good either. So, I don't want to break that. I mean, technically we can clean it right where it's at. And actually just soaking it in the ultrasonic will break up a lot of the varnish that's holding that in place anyway. So we might be better off to leave that. So instead, let's try to clear the emulsion tube a bit. And there's also a screw right here. Under there is the pilot circuit. So we'll try to get that removed so we can clean that out with a bit of carb spray. Ooh, that does not want to come out either. And sometimes the jet is removable, but I'm not seeing any slots there to get that out. So in this case, it's just going to give us a little access to make sure that's clear. So let's see if we can get some of that junk out. Yeah, it broke up easy. That was paper thin. So just, I think some of the stuff that was in the bowl kind of clogged up that passage to the emulsion tube, but now at least we have access to it. And that tube, I don't think is removable either on this carb. So yeah, a little bit harder to clean. That passage seems clear. That one might have been a little blocked. And we got a bent tip. I think that's the problem here. Let's try that. And then the main jet. So we'll just poke a hole so that way the cleaner and the ultrasonic can get through there. And it's plugged pretty good. Usually this tool can poke through it. There we go. And I might actually run some micro drill bits through there. I'm going to start with a really small size and just keep upping the size. I'm not trying to remove any brass, but there is a lot of plaque on this jet. And I don't think just cleaning it in the ultrasonic is necessarily going to get that back to the right size. Yeah, it's a good thing we did that. So for a second there, I thought I was going through the brass, but the plaque, it's just so thick. I don't actually feel any metal on metal. So we might be able to go up one more size. Okay. So that goes through, no issues there. And the pilot circuit, I'm probably most concerned about because a lot of the rust and debris was from here down. And actually, if you were able to remove the main jet, you'd see that it's drilled out into this cavity right here, where it actually picks up fuel through the main jet. The main jet pulls it up through the emulsion tube, but the pilot circuit pulls it up this tube right here. So that should come up into this area where it's mixed with fuel and air through these ports right here. And then it comes in the little holes here on the side. So, if there's a blockage down here on the pickup for the pilot circuit, then, the pilot circuit isn't going to run right. So actually, let's see if we can at least go through the main jet and potentially into that passage. Yeah, I think we just went in there. So let's see how far we went. Yeah. So that passage, if it was blocked up, it isn't anymore. Actually, I think we do have a blockage in the pilot system. When I spray in here straight down, it should go in this passage, which connects over to here, down this passage, and then into this main tube right here. And I'm not seeing any fluid come out of there. Instead, it's just coming out through the air pickup, as well as the little holes in the throat, but nothing down at the fuel pickup. So I think we need to pull this plug and make sure this passage is clear. And hopefully not rip the plug. I don't think this is a part they sell for these carbs. And kind of looks like it's ripping. Let's hope not. Okay, no, it came out. So let's spray in the passage. See if it makes it to the top. Yep. Okay, good. Yeah, I didn't see it at first, but we do have a hole in the bottom of this bowl. So yeah, this bowl is no good. I do have actually the other carb from the other machine, and I also have a parts carb, which actually runs pretty well. The problem with it is that I could never get it to stop leaking. You know, I tried a new gasket, a new bowl. I think I tried a new needle and even swapped out the float. And this will not stop leaking. So as long as it's not the bowl causing the problem, you know, I say we steal this bowl and use it on that carb. And we'll also sync the float. That'll clean it better, and also a better test to see if it leaks. Carburetor cleaned up pretty well. And as far as the main jet goes, you know, there's no need to take that out. It is clean. You know, we really just risk causing damage by forcing it out of there. So instead, I think it's safe to get this back together. And of course, the main jet, it is causing a bit of interference with the float, but thankfully we can sneak it by. Get the pin in. Okay, and now we need to get the plug in. Don't forget the plug. Sometimes these are missing, and if that is missing, then it's bypassing the main jet. And although the pilot circuit will probably be fine, this will actually backfeed past the main jet, causing things to run extremely rich. So I'm actually going to pull this back out, maybe put a bit of WD-40 on it just to help it seat all the way. And I'm actually going to try twisting it a little. There we go. Twist and push. So that is nicely seated. Get the pin back in the center. And let's steal the bowl from the other carb. But I'm not going to steal the bowl nut or the gasket. I'm not sure what was causing this one to leak. I think I did swap everything except the bowl nut. So potentially that is it. All right, that's a good fit. Okay, and lastly, the cap for the pilot circuit. Okay, and that should do it. Although I say that, and I can see this bowl is not seated correctly, so let's loosen this up a little bit. And tighten that back up. Okay, let's try it out. So get the carb reconnected. And like the other one, I'm going to leave the airbox off for now until we know that the carb itself is viable. And this is always tricky, getting this carb installed. More so with the airbox, so don't want to have to do that twice if I don't have to. And like the other machine, I'm going to use a bit of two-stroke fuel. That top end needs all the help it can get. I'm still shocked that the compression came back like it did. I was actually rotating the engine by hand, and when you get to the compression stroke, the leak down is so minimal that the flywheel springs back. And that's a quick and dirty way of checking the health of an engine. When you get to the compression stroke, it shouldn't turn through it too quick. And when you let go, the flywheel, if it springs back, the leak down isn't ridiculously high. And it looks like needle and seat are working. So the fuel line is right there. And it seems to be holding. So I'm going to get a light plugged in. Actually, we'll probably get the starter recoil back on, and we'll try to start this again on its own carburetor and see if the generator works. And actually, this carb is leaking like the parts carb from the bottom, so I'm going to have to double check if I used the right bowl nut. Otherwise, maybe it's the bowl that's the problem. Either way, I still want to test it before we pull it apart again. And I'm going to clean it up a little as well, since we're probably not going to have the recoil off again. So let's get the compression tester out. Not going to start with that in there. And I was able to scrounge up a new plug. So we'll get that installed. Then we'll try to start it. And you don't want to make these too tight, but on a new plug, you do have to crush the crush washer. So once it's crushed, you'll feel like you get a lot tighter like that. All right, I'm just going to top it off with fuel. Not too much, just in case we get a fire. We're already in the run position. Choke is on. We've got the kilowatt and a light plugged in. Well, you can't ask for a whole lot more. It did start, first pull, could turn the choke off right away, and the light turned on. The voltage was pretty much perfect. The engine speed might have been a little slow. It was hard to tell because it was surging in the beginning, but after feeding it some more fuel, that surge went away. So I think we're okay, as far as the carb goes, aside from the leak. So we'll deal with that in a minute. But for now, let's flush the oil again, and then we'll shift focus back to that carburetor. So I think, like last time, I'm just going to let this drip for an extended period of time. And we'll work on the carb while this is draining out. So I double checked the footage, and I definitely grabbed the right bowl nut. So I've got to imagine that the problem is with that bowl, since it was leaking on the other carb as well. So we have this other carb that hopefully has a good bowl. Although the nut's not coming off freely. So, yeah, we're going to have to do some cleaning, I think, on this one. Yep. Yeah, this carb's in much worse shape, and the bowl... It's hard to tell, but I don't think the bowl is actually rusted. And I don't see any holes, so yeah, let's clean this out. Get this bowl in the other one's place and see if the leak stops. Yeah, definitely some corrosion here, some rust. Nothing all the way through, I don't think. So, yeah, not my first choice. I'm going to check to see if I have any other parts carbs. But that might be the best we have. Actually, I did come up with another. Not sure what the story is with this carb. It was in a parts bin, so chances are it has some sort of problem. But from the outside, the bowl looks pretty good. Yeah, this is a better bowl, so I'm going to clean this up, and we'll try this one out, see if it's any better. So let's get this bowl off. Probably could have tried tightening it a little more, but given that it's doing exactly the same thing that this bowl was doing on the other carb, and that one I tried making it pretty tight and had no luck with. So we'll set that aside. The other bowl, it's been cleaned up. And I'm also going to swap the bowl nut and gasket as well. Okay, let's refill and see if the leak stops. So I'm feeding it with fuel. And it might take a few minutes to show itself. But I'm just going to fill it up until the needle shuts down the flow. Which it has. And we'll just wait. See if it stays dry. And we're still leaking. Interesting. So it's not coming from the side. It's definitely the bottom. So why do I have two carburetors that run well, but they just won't seal? Maybe I'm being too nice as far as how tight I'm making this. So let me dry that off, see if that did anything. And I don't know if you noticed either, but this carb, when I took it apart, around the bolt, yeah, it seemed like there was a indication that it was leaking as well. I'll dry at the moment. No, it's leaking. I can see it. The drip forming. So I'm going to try to swap the gasket out here with this one from a Nicky. Not sure what engine that came off of, but really all I'm interested in is stealing this gasket. Now, we've tried two different OEM gaskets, and I've been through this before with the other carb that we stole the bowl from. So I'm not too optimistic here, but I find it hard to believe that I have two carbs that are meant for the same engine that both leak. So this gasket, it is a little bit wider and also a very tight fit around the bolt. The original thinner gasket and a looser fit. So maybe this will work. Not sure. And I'm feeding it some fuel again. Hopefully this time we don't leak. And the needle, it's about to shut off. It's still going down slowly. Looks like it stopped and we're leaking. Incredible. Yeah, I've been spending way too long trying to fix this leak. I would say over an hour at this point. You know, I've tried different combinations of bowls different bowl gaskets, even O-rings, and nothing would stop the leak, even excessively torquing the bowl in place. So, I was about to throw in the towel and just order a clone, and I still might, but I think I finally found the problem here. If we look at the bowl here that has the rot hole in it, you can probably see the material of this bowl is super thin. There's not much to it. And although these other bowls look good, or at least better, I think the leak is actually coming from the bowl itself. It's very hard to tell, but when looking real closely with fuel in it, I do see the fuel weeping from the sides of the bowl. Not the top, not the bottom, but the sides. And there are little areas of corrosion, and I think some of those have gone through and causing the leak. You can actually see right there, a bunch of corrosion. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the bowl that's the problem. I guess we could probably steal the bowl from the clone on the other machine and see if that stops the leak. And these bowls may not be compatible either with the OEM. Kind of hoping they are. So I'm willing to bet it's cheaper to buy a whole clone carb just for the bowl than buying the OEM bowl. And oddly enough, the clone bowl, the material is a lot thicker than the OEM part. So I'm going to use the OEM gasket and bolt with the clone bowl. And it does fit. And I'm filling the carb now with fuel. And now we wait. Amazing. And that's all it was. So those bowls, they looked good, but clearly they had tiny little pinholes allowing fuel to seep out and collect on the bowl bolt. But the clone bowl on the OEM carb, not leaking at all. So I just ordered up 2 clone carbs, $19 each. So they'll be here in a couple days. So for now, I'm going to get some oil in the engine. And I'm going to stick with the OEM carb. I'm just going to swap out the bowl. And I did look into buying an OEM bowl, but given that the clone carbs bowl actually seems to be better, I think we'd be better off using that instead. So we're kind of dead in the water until we get the new carburetor for this machine, but there's nothing holding us back on this one. It is 100%, but we do need to clean it up and fully reassemble it. So we'll do that in a minute, but before I do want to add a wheel kit to this. The owner said this is the machine he's most likely to use due to the electric start, and it would be really convenient to have an easy way to move this around. So to add a wheel kit to this using new parts, it's about $100. And that is something the owner's a little bit sensitive to because I've already spent about $100 in parts, mostly tune-up items, between these two machines. And to sink another $100 in, it's a little questionable. So he would actually prefer that I use the parts on hand, most of which are used but will cost a fraction of the price. So let's see if we can find some combination of parts that'll work for this machine. So I've actually pulled out the parts I think I need to pull this wheel kit off, we have an axle right here. Not sure what machine it came from, but it is the right diameter for the hole that we have here. Now, this machine would have had 6-inch wheels originally, and I didn't have any on hand, so I did actually have to buy a set for 20 bucks that should work. And the axle might already be the right length. You know, initially I was thinking I'd have to cut it, but now that it's here, I think it might work as is. We have a handle for a Briggs & Stratton. It is used and definitely pitted. You know, I painted this at one time, but it is fully functional and good to go. The thing I'm not sure about, though, are the feet. I only have one set to choose from, and I'm not sure if the height is going to be proper. So until we get the wheels on, there's really no way to know for sure. You know, I did some quick measurements, and I think they're going to be close. So yeah, let's get the wheels on, and then we'll figure out the rest. Yeah, we're going to have to cut this. Right now we're centered, so we have just as much sticking out on the other side. But these wheels too, they actually seem a little bit undersized. And the foot, definitely too long by about an inch. So let's actually put some 8-inch wheels on here and see if that takes care of both problems. Maybe this will fit better and we don't have to modify that axle. Not my first choice in color, but I guess yellow does complement red. Yeah, and that's going to be perfect. Now we don't have to modify the axle. He's got bigger wheels. And I think that's going to take care of this problem as well. Not to mention they're free. Originally, this only had a foot in the middle, and I was thinking about adding one on each side, but then I tried test fitting it, and I think the existing holes drilled in the frame are a perfect match for this one. Yeah, so no modification needed. It's a perfect match. And we're even level. or at least pretty close. I think we measure just under a 1/4 inch lower on the right side versus the left, but as it sits, I don't think it's going to be an issue. So we'll get the chrome polished up. And this is usually the first thing to rust up when these are left outside. So the fact that this chrome is as good as it is, well, confirms that it wasn't really stored outdoors. I did check with the owner. I told him about all the water. And he was kind of beside himself. He's always stored this indoors. He said a majority of the time it was in his garage and more recently in his shed. So if I had to guess, I would say that water came from condensation. When you store something like this, like in a garage, the garage might get cold. And then during the day or the morning, once things warm up, you open up that door and a rush of warm, humid air comes in, hits a cold block, and condensation will form, both inside and outside of the engine block. And it's enough that maybe a few drips of water will form and fall into that oil. And if you take that process, multiply it over 15 years, that would probably account for the water. Anyway, this, for the most part, is going to clean up really well. The only exception is the bottom rail. Because this was used without a wheel kit on construction sites, this sat on the ground, got dragged around, and it knocked some of the paint off. So the bottom rail, especially on this side, definitely rusted up a bit. But it's not rotten. So the owner can touch that up if he wants. So we're going to have to get the fuel line connected and kind of sandwich everything together here. So we have the airbox cover, a gasket, of course the carburetor, the studs. Fuel line has to go right along here, and the hardest part is getting the breather where it belongs. And it looks like we are missing a couple plastic fasteners over here on this side. I don't know if they're absolutely critical, but yeah, they do kind of hold the heat shield in place. So I could put a bolt through there. I guess the issue is the tank is going to be in the way. The tank gets secured right there, but there is a little gap between the tank and the bushing right there. So I might be able to sneak a couple zip ties through to help keep this in place. And that way too, I'm not using metal. So if it does rub on the tank, hopefully it does not rub a hole into the tank. Well, it's a couple days later, and I ended up putting the heat shield in the tank as well as the airbox back on this machine, just like we did over there. And the only thing left is swapping the bowls. So I've got the new clone carb here. So let's get the bad bowl off, put the good in its place, and then we'll get both of these outside for the load test. And just for the record, I ended up cleaning up the first Nicky carb we pulled off these machines. It was pretty bad, but, it did clean up. I think the biggest issue with it was the needle. I had to replace that. So theoretically, this carb is good to go with a good bowl. So if we have any issues with either of these carbs, this is definitely an option. Well, it is the moment of truth. So the question is, will either of these machines reach their rated load? Of that, I do have my doubts, but these machines have been surprising me pretty much every step of the way. So let's get the engine started and find out. All right, so the engine started right up. The no-load speed's about 62 Hertz, voltage 120 volts. So, that seems good on the surface, but the XLs usually like a little bit more voltage at no load. So we might have to bump that up a little. THD is around 5.4%, and the sine wave, a little jagged, but doesn't look too bad. So let's try a half load. Start with 1,000 watts. The engine speed kind of sagged a lot. We're at 60 Hertz. Let's try 1,500, 2,000. So yeah, the engine speed isn't great. We're at about 58 Hertz. THD is at 14%, and the sine wave looks pretty good, although the voltage is down a bit. Anyway, let's give this a few minutes and then we'll try to bring up the load some more and see how much you can take. Alright, it's been a few minutes. Engine speed isn't quite as bad as I thought. It's around 59 Hertz, so we do have a little bit of room to spare. Voltage, though, is low at about 113 volts, so I think we are going to have to bring that voltage up a bit. But let's try increasing the load a little bit more. So, take this off. Now we're back to 2,000. Let's try 2,500. 3,000. It's doing it, surprisingly. Let's go back to 3,000. How about 3,500? 4,000. Yeah, it's fighting. Oh! Okay, not good. Okay, that was not good. So, the engine didn't like it, and we're actually running fast now. What is that, about 64 Hertz? Yeah. So, yeah, I think that has to do with engine heat. Could also have to do with the idle speed. So actually, let's check that, make sure the idle set screw isn't causing a problem now that the engine's warm. Alright, so I just made a few adjustments. I backed off the engine speed a bit. We're now closer to 61.5 Hertz, and I brought the voltage up to 125 volts. Now, that still doesn't explain why the engine cut out. You know, if we were out of horsepower, I would expect a gradual decline. And that's not what we saw. It just collapsed for a second. So potentially a bad plug is what comes to mind. So I'm a little hesitant to bring the load back on, but I think we should. So let's start with 2,000 watts. That's a pretty big drop in speed. Let's try 2,500. Yeah, that's a big drop in speed. So I don't think we're down on power. You know, this could be a governor issue or a clone carb issue. Let's just bump the throttle. Yeah, we don't have any issues at all with horsepower. So I think we have multiple issues going on here. Maybe a governor issue, maybe a spark plug issue, maybe a clone carb issue. So let's let things cool down And I think for now, I'm going to roll this one out of the way. We'll test the other one, see if we can at least check that one off the list, and then go back to fixing this one. Surprisingly, no smoke though. All right, we got number 2 up. This one's rated at 3,500 watts, and this one is the one I gave no chance of running again. So let's get it started and see how much of a load it can pull. All right, so this one started up without too much issue. No load speeds around 60 Hertz. Voltage also a little low at about 121 volts. So potentially we might need to tweak that as well. Without a load, we're starting at 5.7% THD, and the sine wave looks about the same as the other machine. So let's bring on the 2,000 watt load, which is just over half load for this machine. So we'll start with, whoa, 1,000 watts, almost stalled it. How about 1,500 watts? Yeah, it actually seems like a governor issue, because it recovers and actually runs pretty well. Let's try another 500. Yeah, it's maintaining speed actually very well. So under a 2,000 watt load, we're at 13.1% THD. Voltage came down a bit, and sine wave not as jagged, but a little more deformed. So I'm curious, if I take the load off, is the governor going to overreact? Yeah, it's kind of over revving, bouncing around a little, but it is stabilizing. It's not a surge that doesn't go away, but that initial surge or that initial drop is really bad. Anyway, we'll put it back to 2,000 watts, give it a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 3,500. Yeah, it seems like we might have developed a problem here. So things were going well until they weren't. So I'm going to take the load off, and I think we're going to shut this one down. Actually, before we shut it down, because I'm not sure I'm going to start it again, let's see how much power is left in this. So, we'll do 1,000 watts, it almost stalled. Starting to smoke again. 1,500 watts. 2,000 watts. Let's try to bring it up a little more. I'm going to swap these. I'm not sure it's going to like it. All right, back to 2,000 watts. 2,500. 3,000. Yeah, we're out of horsepower at 3,000, I would say. We're at about 55 Hertz. And, well, we're scaring away the bugs. So I'm going to take the load off. We'll let things cool down. And then we'll shut it down. I was about to shut it down, but I'm actually noticing oil right here by the valve cover. So I'm wondering if we don't have an issue with the breather or maybe the seal. I'm not sure, but I'm going to put a load on again. I just want to see what happens kind of in this area. And of course, there's other reasons an engine can smoke. You know, if the oil is overfilled, too thin, you know, the breather's clogged, but another good reason is damaged cylinder, stuck rings, and or damaged rings. And with this machine, we know the cylinder's damaged, and I've got to imagine the rings aren't in great shape either. So we're at 2,000 watts. We're not smoking yet. Yeah, I was hoping maybe that oil was somehow splashing on the exhaust, but that's not the case. There's definitely oil, excessive oil, getting into the combustion chamber. So, yeah, now we'll take the load off, shut it down, and I think this machine is likely going to be retired. I also pulled the cover off the airbox because I noticed we were leaking oil from there as well. We've already soaked the new filter. So that was coming actually from the engine breather tube right there. So if the rings aren't doing their job, you know, excessive pressure goes into the crankcase and pushes out through there. And if there's too much pressure coming out, it's going to take oil with it. And some of that oil was getting sucked back into the intake, creating that smoke. And I'm sure some also coming by the rings as well. So yeah, this engine, not in great shape. You know, a new set of rings could definitely help it out. But ultimately, the cylinder is pretty damaged. And I don't think honing is going to fix it. So I would say likely this is a parts machine. You know, potentially the other one is as well. You know, we didn't see any smoke from that. So I'm going to keep going with this, see if we can fix the issue with the engine speed and get this back out here for another test, see if we can get it performing any better. Actually, let's work on this one out here. I have something on the lift right now. It is a nice day out. Fortunately, I'm kind of working against the clock. There is rain moving in probably in the next hour, so we're going to have to work quick. But I went back, just double-checked the footage on when this machine stumbled, and it didn't appear to lose spark. So although the governor doesn't seem to be responding very well, we do have a clone carb on there. So I did clean up the original, so I'm thinking before we make any drastic changes here, let's put the OEM carb back on, and then we'll get it started again, see if there's any improvement. Let's see if we have any oil on this filter. No, surprisingly good. So, although I'm sure this one is blow-by, it doesn't seem like it's excessive like the other machine. So we're going to swap the bowls. So I'm stealing the one here from the OEM carb. Or sorry, this is the clone carb. And we'll put it on the OEM one. All right, let's try this machine again. We've got the OEM carb connected up. The fuel's turned on, and we're not flooding over, so off to a good start. Of course, this carb is unproven, and it was in pretty bad shape. So, yeah, let's get the engine started and see if it can do any better than that brand new clone. All right, no issues getting it started with the clone carburetor. The engine speed is a little bit unsteady. It is surging a bit, and it was surprisingly slow, so I did have to bring that spring tension up quite a bit. I guess the question is, will this improve at all under load? So, the THD and the sine wave, that's not going to change a whole lot based on the carburetor. And we already showed those before, but if we do make it up to 4,000 watts, I'll capture that. But let's put on a load. Let's start with 2,000 watts. Let's see how it reacts. Yeah, it's running pretty smooth, actually. Let's try 3,000. No issues. 3,500. Yeah? How about 4,000? Yeah, it's doing it. The speed might be around 57 Hertz, so a little bit on the low side. THD is at about 16%. And the sine wave, it's distorted, but fairly typical. So it's pulling 4,000 watts without an issue. So let's give it a few minutes, see how it does. Yeah, no issues at all pulling 4,000 watts. We're right at 57 Hertz, which is on the low side of okay. Voltage also came down to about 114 volts, which is fairly typical. I do see some voltage droop on these, but nothing like generators without an ABR. So really anything above 113 volts under full load is fine. So I would say it's a pass. And most importantly, we're not smoking at all. So the engine, although not the healthiest one I've seen, definitely still up to the task. So we'll take the load off. Let's see if the surge comes back. And yeah, at 1,000 watts it is surging. Same thing with 1,500. So it's really not until you get to about 2,000 where that main jet comes into play and starts to smooth things out. So yeah, I guess the good news is we don't have engine issues, we don't have governor issues, but we still do have carb issues. So I'm going to take this load off. We'll let things cool down, and then I'm going to do another carb swap. And I'm not going to record the carb swap this time, but this one is an OEM Nicky. This is the one actually I pulled off of another engine quite some time ago because I couldn't get it to stop leaking, although it was running well. And as we found out, it has a bad bowl. So I'm willing to bet this one hopefully will solve our problem. So I'm going to get this one bolted on. We'll swap bowls and we'll try this one more time. All right, the carb's been swapped out again. Let's give this another go. So we're off to a much better start. This time the engine's running nice and smooth, right around 61.8 Hertz. This stuff I've actually shut down. We're not going to need that for this test. We just want to see how it reacts under load and also when we take the load off. So let's start with 1,000 watts. Doing fine. How about 2,000? How about 3,000? Yeah, it's doing it, although we're getting close to 57 Hertz. How about 3,500? 4,000. Yeah, it looks like everything is holding. So let's give this a few minutes, make sure there's no surprises. And we're finally there. We're pulling its rated load of 4,000 watts. Voltage is good, at least passable, and so is the engine speed. So the OEM carb, once again, for the win. So we'll take the load off. We'll let things cool down a bit. And actually, before I shut it down, let's try the auto idle. Make sure that works. And actually, we're going to turn the cooling fans off. Yeah, and there we go. And technically, we were overloading it, right? Because we had the light on. and the cooling fan. So we actually pulled 4,300 watts out of this machine. So yeah, pretty impressive, and the auto idle seems to be working just fine. Yeah, not too bad. All right, guys, and that is pretty much it. We managed to beat the rain, and these machines thankfully didn't beat us, although the one here on the right did give me a run for my money. You know, going into this, I thought we were just getting two old machines that had fuel system problems, and of course, once they arrived, I realized we were dealing with much more serious issues. The one on the left was stuck. The one on the right had virtually no compression, so I didn't give either of these much of a chance of running again. Yet, both of these now start on the first pull and make power. The one here on the left, granted, it is wounded. It does need a new engine, but we made it a lot further than I thought we would with this. And we even got up to about a half load before the smoke show started. And the one here on the right definitely fought us quite a bit. And really all of that can be attributed to the clone carburetor. You know, it did seem to run the engine well when we were testing it, but once we got it out here, we could see that it was not running the engine right. The engine speed was very unstable, and when approaching a full load, the engine almost stalled. So we got a good OEM carb in the clone's place, and pretty much all those problems went away. So this machine had no issues pulling its rated load of 4,000 watts with a good OEM carb, and we actually exceeded that by about 300. And it kept running strong and no smoke from this machine. So I would say this machine, it is good to go. And the one here on the left, likely best as a parts machine. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.